We hope you enjoy this podcast. All our conversations are inspired by films we have selected to appear on SDG.VISION. So go and take a look and be inspired by people and organisations who are making valuable contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and making our world a better place for everybody to live. Now, sit back, enjoy, be inspired, and afterwards, go and take action.
Well, I've just finished reading this book, and I think it's a really important book to read for everybody. And the reason I say that is because it covers an issue that we at SDG Vision have been talking about for quite some time now, which is the importance of changing the world requires us to change our consciousness. And by that, I mean the way that we relate to the world, the way we relate to others, the places we live in, the country we live in, importantly, our relationship to nature. And for us in the know, we are actually part of nature. And this book addresses those issues head on. And I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome its author, Alina Siegfried, to the SDG Vision podcast. Hello, Alina.
Good morning.
Hi, and I mean every single word of that. I've just finished reading it. I've been reading it for about a week now. And I do think it's really important, and I haven't read a book like it. And so I'm really keen to get stuck into delving a little bit deeper, perhaps, and for those who haven't read the book, to get a feel for what it's about. Now, first of all, we've got apologies because where Alina is, it's 6 a.m. in the morning.
It is early.
I'm amazed you're looking so bright and bushy-tailed, Alina, but so I thank you for that. So sort of first of all, Alina, I guess, where are you speaking to us from, and what's it like to live and to work there?
Kia ora. Kia ora koutou. That's a way of saying hello, everybody, in Māori. I'm in Wellington, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So yes, it is quite early here this morning, 6 a.m. I've been here in this city for about 15 years coming up. It's the capital city of New Zealand. Yeah, it's a pretty vibrant place to be for the most part. Lots of it's a bit of a creative centre, lots of startups. It's the focal point of the film industry in New Zealand. And yeah, the capital city, as I said.
No, terrific. And you said, I think you're just moving between seasons at the moment. You say it's pretty chilly in the morning there.
We are, yeah. We're in spring in Wellington, and spring in New Zealand, and particularly Wellington, is notoriously bad weather. So we've had about 4 days of gale force winds,
Wow.
and then but a bit of rain most days. So it's very windy time in springtime. Yeah.
Interesting. Now, what I haven't told our viewers so far is what you are, what you do, or part of what you do. You're a poet. We've already found out you're an author. You're an activist, and importantly, you're a mother as well. And we'll probably touch on all of those things, I imagine, during our conversation. And first thing I wanted to know, really, what first moved you to take action around issues of sustainability and systems change, which is an important part of the book? And when did you realise that story can be a useful lever for transformational change?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I've worked in sustainability for quite a long time. I studied physical geography at school. I started out in geology, but moved to geography in the end. And interestingly, my my drive to study geology was I was very interested in volcanoes, in part having been on Mount Ruapehu when it erupted in 1995. So I had this. It was a small eruption. Nobody died, but But it took me off in this really interesting direction of, okay, so I'm quite interested in the earth, the physical process of the earth. There was a bit of resource management in there, and I did Antarctic studies as well. So it had always been a little bit on my radar, sustainability. I didn't consider myself overly political or action oriented for most of my 20s. It's quite the typical go off to uni and drink a lot and, have a fun time. But I got a job straight after university. I studied for 4 years, and I got a job as a ranger, basically, a hut warden in a national park in New Zealand. And that was, it's my favourite place in New Zealand, Tongariro National Park. Beautiful place, same place where that volcano is. And just getting to spend 6 months out in the hills, away from computers, away from cognitive work, and just, I had a few hours of things that I had to do during the day, say hello to everybody in the evening at the huts, clean up the kitchen, clean the toilets was not so much fun. Cleaning long drops is not a good time. And then I had the rest of the day to myself. So I spent many, many hours just wandering in the mountains. And that really solidified, I think, what I already had a good grounding and a love of nature. But I think what really opened my eyes to the power of story was, it's the story that opens the book, Pierre, is I was working in the Canadian prairies for an environmental non-profit. It was a provincial level NGO, and I was working as their water issues coordinator and rolling out a public education campaign on water conservation. And, we had these sort of PowerPoint presentations we'd do at schools or whatever, or, a little booklet about how to, save water, refitting your washing machine taps, replacing leaky taps. It was all very sort of quite dry, if you excuse the pun. And at the same time, I was discovering the spoken word community in Saskatoon, where I lived in Saskatchewan, and really enjoying the performance element of going to see poets perform their work from the stage. So these two things intersected, and I decided to make that water conservation campaign a bit more personal. I would put myself on a water conservation diet as such, and use no more than 25 litres of water per day to meet all my daily needs. Cooking, flushing, laundry, drinking, everything. And for context, the average Canadian was using about 230 litres per day, probably add another 100 or so for the United States. So that was a very significant reduction in the amount of water, and I wrote a poem about it. I'd been reading a lot about the geopolitical aspect of water, the water wars in some areas of the world. It was being very much used as a political lever. And so I wrote this poem about some of those issues, but grounded in my own experience of, having to suddenly survive on much reduced levels of water, particularly laundry was quite challenging. And I got an incredible response, not just on the night, but I would have, I had people coming up to me in the street weeks and months later, like proudly telling me how they were saving their water, like they were catching water in a bucket in the shower to water their plants. And some of these people were, not the usual poetry crowd. Like a few of them, maybe, I don't know, they've been there on the night for whatever reason, but one woman in a really smart suit came up to me and was telling me very proudly. I thought, there's something here, They've taken this thing which is quite obscure and a bit boring, water conservation, and actually really engaged people on it. So that was really the birth of it.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that it wasn't just the usual suspects, and I think that's when you're on.
Yeah, and I found that along the way with a lot of my poetry is that it has the power to hit a broad range of people, and I've just found that delightful.
And of course, your part of your book, well, the explanation of it, or the sort of the not the main title, is the power of story to transform the world and ourselves. And I think
Yeah.
that's why at the beginning I said I'm so excited by this, because a lot of your work talks about the importance of doing work on yourself. And that's probably why poetry also, I mean, story and storytelling is as old as mankind, probably. And it really does resonate with people, doesn't it? For the reasons that you said, it resonates with not just people who you would expect it to resonate with. So, yeah, I think that was, I've said on several podcasts that story and creating a vision of that things can be better is really important. And historically it's something that I was going to say progressives, but again, I don't want to get into the us and them, and we'll come on to that. The us and them, we're progressives, you're not progressive, and all that. But people who are interested in being part of developing, a better way of being for ourselves and for the world that we live in. We're not good at telling stories, are we? Really, or visioning, or visions of what it can be, or what life can be.
Not always, and it's interesting you mentioned there. Progressives in particular have historically not been great. We've been pretty bad at showing that how life can be a different way. And there's been a lot of commentary over this over the past couple of decades, in particular. George Lakoff's book, Don't Think of an Elephant. I think that was 2004 or 5 or around about. So that's been around for a while. But that I read that as a young political staffer, about 15 years ago, maybe a little more. And it really changed the way that I thought about storytelling. But that book talks about how, a great tragedy of a lot of progressive causes, or, of the political left, dare I get, drawn into the left versus right continuum, which is, a bit of a farce in itself. There's a lot of us are sort of in the interesting muddled middle. But I think a lot of the challenges is that the left tends to rely on data and facts and figures and logic to sway people, and they almost act as if the receiving audience is a bunch of these AI robots who just need the right data to update their programming, and then they will act a different way. And they make, I think, the decision of assuming and thinking and believing that people make rational decisions that are always in their best interest, or the best interest of the collective. And the truth is that humans are not a very rational species. You look around at the world around us. No other species trashes their own living environment. That's a uniquely human trait. But we live our lives and make our decisions based on emotion, which is fueled by story. The advertising industry knows this very well. If reason and logic had swayed us, we would have solved the climate crisis 40 years ago. But we're full of these unconscious biases and heuristics, mental shortcuts about how we make decisions. And so much of that is fueled by story. The political right have been very good at telling a compelling story. That's how they solidify their support base. They talk about their values constantly, which is another really really important aspect. Is rather than focusing on the values that unite us as people who are interested in looking after the planet, interested in collectivism and living, in societies with less inequality. We don't often ground that in our values, whereas you'll see a lot of politicians and people and campaigners on the political right are constantly talking about values. What is it, that they really believe in, and that's what motivates people. Talking about what kind of a world do we want to live in, using that future-focused, visionary language, rather than waving another report on climate change about. I'll just say that's not to say the science isn't important, but it's story that moves us here, and that's where we need to move, not here.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think yes. I mean, obviously the science is really important because hey, the science is on our side, really, in terms of, but not everybody is interested in facts and figures, or moved by, and you've got to move people, and also people often with the climate crisis, as we've been talking about, people can feel paralyzed by that, and that can lead to even more inaction, paralysis. And how do you shift people out of paralysis? Well, by reaching into their heart and their soul. So that I think, I mean, that's one of the reasons that I was so interested in this book, because you don't hear this often. I think it is becoming recognized that the value of storytelling and stories, but not enough. And also I wonder, in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, obviously we're a channel that are really primarily dedicated to promoting the Sustainable Development Goals and positive action towards them. And, there's 17 goals, and it's quite visual the way that they're presented, and it's quite simple in its layout as a framework. And I wonder whether you see that as I kind of know the answer because I've read the book, but I wonder, it would be interesting to hear whether you think it's a useful framework for change makers and artists, as we've said, really important part of those change makers. And if you do, what SDGs would you say that you're most closely aligned with and with your work and your life?
Yeah, I think, the SDGs are fantastic, I think, for what they are as a framework of goals and targets that really outline the kind of world that we want to live in. They represent that collective roadmap as such, which is helpful because we want to know where we are going. So I think, for change makers working in one of those areas of the 17 goals, perhaps in government or non-profit or NGO or whatever the modality is, it's a useful framework for aligning those programs of work and slotting them in. I think, where I see the SDGs falling down a little bit is that they're aside from partnership for the goals, which is my favourite one because we do need to consider all of these problems as an interconnected consequence of the kind of stories we've been telling ourselves about how the world is. But there's a lot of focus. I see the focus on the symptoms. Without recognising those fundamentally flawed stories upon which the foundation of our Western civilization, especially, is built, and in which, from that flawed mindset, so many of these problems arose. So the SDGs, I think, are really fantastic at addressing the structural levers that we need to pull to start shifting the dial on some of these big problems. And to some extent, they work on the relational levers as well, and particularly the goals relating to helping to lift the developing world. And I use quote marks around that phrase because I think there is an enormous amount of wisdom that the West can gain from developing countries, from the collectivism mindset that's in some of these countries, the way they look after resources in a much better way. But those goals that are related to lifting the global South as such out of poverty is a relational dynamic as well. But I think the risk with the SDGs is they don't do a whole hell of a lot to support the transformation of of our understanding of those foundational narratives upon which our society is built. And that's the really hard stuff to change with systems change, is to change our mindsets and our assumptions about, the way things are.
I was really interested. There's a point that you made in your book that says that you actually prefer the word regeneration to the word sustainable, which made me think. Do you want to explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sustainability is a word that's been around for what it was the Rio Earth Summit, I think, that became part of the popular vernacular in 1992. So, here we are, almost 40 years later. My maths is wrong there, but you can do the maths. But a long time later, here we are, and sustainability to me, I mean, it's become a bit of an empty word. It's a buzzword. It's in every organisation's policy is to be sustainable, but to me, if I look around at our relationship with the natural world, that it is fundamentally broken. And so there's not a lot of point in sustaining a broken system. We've already gone beyond we've gone beyond several of the planetary boundaries. And so, for me, regeneration instead, it embeds a bit more of a duty of care and a responsibility. And that word, evokes ideas of actually giving back and repairing Earth systems that we have broken. So that's part of one of the mindset shifts, one of the 10 new myths for humanity that I've got in the last section of the book, is shifting from a mindset of sustainability to actually how do we regenerate what it is that we've really broken or at least damaged in a fundamental way over the last 200 years really of industrial progress, but particularly over the last 40 or 50 years.
And of course, they're not mutually exclusive, are they? Because
no, of course not.
You once you've regenerated, then you can ensure that they are sustained. So I thought that was a very interesting take on the word sustainable, and it's just one of the very few, very many parts of your book that I found really thought provoking.
I got to do a content series it was around the time of COVID actually. So 2019, 2020, I was doing a content series on regenerative agriculture in New Zealand. And that's what really sparked my interest in that area is, and we interviewed some people, did podcasts and webinars with people from across the world as well as New Zealand, but, who were actually farming in different ways that, rather than being an extractive model that takes all the nutrients out of the soil, actually uses the animals and their hooves and certain seed and flour mixes to actually regenerate the land.
Well, you've mentioned, and I mentioned at the beginning, sort of systems change and systemic change. And in your book, you say that there are sort of three ways to achieve system change, and you identify these as structural, relational, and transformative. And I wondered whether you could explain that to us.
So that categorization system comes from a systems change report, actually. And it's called the Water of Systems Change, if you look that up. Or if you just search for the 6 conditions of systems change online, you'll find this inverted pyramid diagram. And at the top of that inverted pyramid are the structural changes for systems change. So those are the explicit changes. That's where you've got policies, practices, resource flows, And that's, predominantly where I think the SDGs focus. That's the things like, what are we actually going to do about these problems? That's where it's the charitable funding, or the corporate social responsibility, the social enterprise, or the buy one, give one models, and so on. And I see those as the low-hanging fruit in many ways, because they directly address the symptoms of a problem without necessarily having to delve into the complexities of what created that problem. So that's the structural change. At the relational change in the middle of that pyramid, that addresses relationships, connections, and power dynamics. And that's referred to as the sort of the semi-explicit conditions for change. And these are a bit harder to address because they require us to do a bit of questioning about our place in society, the power that we hold, the privilege that we might hold, and the predominant narratives that we have as a society about who holds power and why. So that's why we might look at the question of why do we have, or what are the conditions that have created the global South versus the global North, the nations that have affluence versus poverty. And so those are a bit trickier. They require some honest conversations. And in the bottom of that inverted pyramid is the transformative aspects of change. And those are the implicit conditions, and they're quite tricky and they're quite wily, because we don't even realise that we're adhering to them most of the time. They are our mental models and ways of thinking about the world, and about the way things are. And those are really hard to shift unless we shine a light on them and name that we are informed by these subconscious narratives that we're fundamentally all agreeing to every day, or maybe we don't agree with them, but they are the water in which we swim, which is where the title of that report comes from, is the old story with the two fish swimming in water, and one fish says to the other fish, oh, the water's cold today, and the other fish says, what's water? So that's what these narratives that we're swimming in are. They're subconscious to us for the most part. But they inform everything about our society and the world around us. So I mean, if we're to look at one of those models, let's take shoes. I think Tom Shoes was one of the earliest examples of the buy one, give one model. Really well made, fair trade shoes. That's a structural intervention. We're like, right, buy a pair of shoes, and I know that a pair of shoes is being given to, a child in need in some other country. It's a structural thing. It's obvious. We can see the tangible effects. If we look at the relational level of conditions of systems change, we might ask, who is making my shoes? Are they being paid well? Why is it that it's cheaper to make shoes in Bangladesh than it is to make shoes in America? And do I agree with the logic underpinning that? And then at the transformative level of mental modes, we might ask all number of myriad questions around, rather than buying a pair of shoes and giving one away, what are the unbalanced economic structures that have caused that? What are the narratives of consumption and self-identity that is wrapped up in a pair of shoes? What are the narratives of Western supremacy that have contributed towards those children needing shoes in the first place? So it's much harder, to really address those big meaty questions at the bottom of the inverted pyramid, because they're just so insidious. They're just assumed narratives about how the world is, to use a pithy phrase, but that's what we all sort of subtly agree to.
it's very true, and we don't take a step back and analyse how we relate to them, because we're not often aware that it's not a natural thing. It's a man-made narrative that governs our world, and narrative plays a really, really central part, really, to this book, doesn't it? In terms of you mentioned that you identified 10 dominant narratives that shape the world today, and then you provide counter narratives or possible alternative narratives to them. Perhaps could you explain? I think you've given us a flavour, but could you explain perhaps a bit more concretely what you see as some of those dominant narratives?
Yeah, so I think I use the word myth in my book in a different way than most people. So these days, the word myth has almost become a bit of a dirty word, right? It's you hear things like trickle down economics as a myth, or a different person might say climate change is a myth. It's become synonymous with lies, whereas the word myth originally was a story or a seed of truth, a seed of human truth wrapped up in a story to make it easier to share, and almost as an educational tool. It's a way of passing along knowledge about inherent truths about the world. So I do reframe a lot of our predominant narratives in terms of they are myths that we can shift, and new myths for humanity. So some of those dominant economic narratives, are the ones underpinning our modern form of capitalism. We need exponential growth in international trade in order to maintain equality of life for all people on Earth. Selling of goods and services is always good, no matter the cost. The story of GDP as, gross domestic product as a way of measuring a country's prosperity is in many ways so perverse. The story of GDP tells us that if I go and buy an iPhone or a pair of shoes or an electronic device tomorrow, and it breaks within a year, that this is a good thing for the economy, right? Because then I have to go and buy another one, and it's like, oh, wonderful, excellent, trade, so these sorts of mindsets are very pervasive, and it's especially the economic ones drive us to look at everything and assess everything in terms of monetary value. And this assumption that the best way to have a society or live in a society, a modern society, is one where everyone can access the things they need, and need in itself is an interesting story. Need or want in a fiat-based money system, and that's the best way of exchange and trade. And then we live in a bunch of cultural narratives around. I spoke a little bit around Western supremacy before, and that's aside from the economic argument, it's also this this notion that logic and reason and scientific proof are the gold standard and the superior ways of knowing. And that all other ways of knowing, particularly ones that are, harder to objectively measure, indigenous ways of knowing, of sensing, of intuiting things, are inferior. It's that kind of siloed thinking that has created so many of these issues that the SDGs now are trying to tackle. It's this story that everything is separate from everything else, and that we're all individual entities, massive cultural narrative of individualism in the West versus more collectivist narratives in indigenous societies. And social narratives around wealth creation, and why is it that we assume that somebody who has studied a lot more. Why is it that doctors and lawyers, we just sort of all accept that their work is more valuable than teachers and nurses? And why? why do we? Why is that an agreed thing that we've all? And I don't say agree as in we had a choice, but it's an unassumed thing. It's not a thing that people have conversations about typically. So for me, the narrative change is around just subtle shifts in how we talk about the world and the way things are, and it comes back to that idea of painting a vision.
Yeah, and I think we had a little glimpse for a short period of time during COVID-19 where people began to realise the value of health, the health sector workers, caregivers, and the value of looking out for each other. But it was remarkable, wasn't it, really, how difficult these dominant narratives are to shift, because as soon as normal life resumed, that new way of looking at things and engaging with each other kind of changed pretty quickly.
It really did. I just well remember the level of excitement that I saw in some communities, and I don't wish to say, that we discount the terrible, horrible loss of life that COVID-19 created, but there was a real sense of hope. That there was this catchphrase of "let's not go back to normal," because normal was not very good. But we have really slipped back into old ways of thinking quite quickly. And it's interesting you mentioned COVID-19, because part of what I talk about in the book, and I think part of shifting our narratives, comes down to framing and the everyday language that we use. And there was some really interesting differences in the ways you saw different political figures around the world framing COVID and what we should do about it. So, we had Boris Johnson speaking about COVID-19 being a fight in which every citizen is directly enlisted to fight. So this real, warlike mentality, like we have to fight this thing and we are the heroes and we're going to, whereas, here in New Zealand, which has, for better or worse, been held up as a real example to the world about how to manage a pandemic. We had our Prime Minister talking about everyone being in the same boat. So quite a different frame of collectivism and, hey, we're in this together, and we're gonna lock down so that we can protect everybody in our society. Just a very, very big difference in terms of the mentality underlying those choices of words.
Yeah, and that framing and that narrative, I mean, it can get pretty ugly, can't it, when people are entrenched in a certain viewpoint. We became aware of your work through a fantastic film that we're showing on the channel called A Cure for Them. And it really is... it's quite startling, actually, looking at it for the first time, because you're kind of aware that, a lot of our views are so entrenched, and we think we've got the right answer. That I'm a progressive and you're you're not. That actually, there's storytelling and there's story listening. I think you say in your book as well, and that it's important to be a good story listener as well. And divisiveness probably comes about by people not listening carefully to others that they think are wrong, and not listening to their whole story and the reason why they take the view that you disagree with. So I wonder, can poetry and the arts, do you think then, or how can they nudge people from that sort of us versus them identity or way of engaging?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's such a tricky one, because we're up against these, tech giants that that feed off of fear and hatred, and actually benefit greatly from keeping our society in a state of division. It's a good it's a good business model for them, division. So I see divisiveness and polarization, increasing around the world. We see it all over the place. We need only look to America for a great example of that at the moment. But it's a barrier for us to actually see each other as a whole person. So we're a storytelling species, and we have very powerful stories that we have about each other. And when we don't have the space to actually sit and listen to somebody's story, or if they're telling a story, but we notice in ourselves, the heckles are coming up, they're saying something that I disagree with, I can feel my blood rising, I'm getting annoyed, then you're not listening anymore, and you're not listening to. You're not being curious about how is it that they got to their position, or what are the underpinning values that they have that are different from my own, that are causing them to see the world differently from me. So for me, stories, telling them, and even more importantly, really listening to them, is an invitation to somebody else's experience or somebody else's world that doesn't seek to attack or discredit, but just seeks to understand. And when someone's telling a personal story, not necessarily about a political issue or whatever, but they're telling a story about their life, about how they got, to a thought, nobody feels stupid when a story is being told, because you're just listening to somebody's story. You can't argue with a person's own journey. And so there's something really, really powerful in that. And yeah, gosh, the Cure for Them poem, really interesting moment with that, I think. I first performed that poem on the 13th of March in 2019 at an Impact Summit, and it was like a lovely audience. It was well received. It was it struck people here, and then 2 days later in New Zealand, down in Christchurch, we saw a massive atrocity, worst terrorist attack that we've ever seen, when we had a gunman enter 2 mosques and kill 50 people. Based entirely on, that divisiveness and polarization, hatred for the other. And it was just such a stark thing to see, those two very different environments. And, I don't want to perhaps give away the whole thing if you watch the poem, but it was bizarre even to see our Prime Minister using the same words that I end the poem with. We are us, and they are us, and we are them. And she spoke about the Muslim community as they are us. That's part of us. Which was a beautiful frame to start healing that division and start seeing ourselves as part of a larger us. Alex Evans in the UK talks is a fantastic author and talks about a larger us. Our concept of who is us, and for every us, there's the polarity of it is there's a them. And what if we stopped seeing so many thems around and grew our awareness of who is us?
It takes a degree of patience and understanding to be a listener, a story listener.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, it can be. It can be. And you know that there are times when you're listening to a story and you think, well, I know what this person's about, and I know that, and you think you have to say to yourself, no, I need to listen to this whole story to understand why they have the views that they have. And then you talk about poetry slam, it's almost like a story slam, isn't it? In the sense that we need to create a more engaging, not only engaging story, but a story that hits people in the heart and win not just the minds, but the hearts of people as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting what you said there. I came across a quote from Abraham Lincoln recently that just says, he said, "I don't like that man. I must learn more about him," or I must like find out more about him. I find out why is it that I don't like him, and obviously see beyond what I don't like. So story in the arts and poetry is really great for just inspiring people on a fun level. It's quite fun because activism can feel very heavy. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of that mentality of I'm fighting against. Whereas I think arts often gives us the opportunity to say what it is that we are for. And so as relational creatures, we can, gravitate towards somebody saying, painting their vision of what they would like to see is often a bit more of an inviting thing to engage with than somebody who's being incredibly combative. And, it's like that water poem that I spoke of earlier is I didn't inspire people because I gave them a pamphlet. I inspired them because I told them my story and, the struggles of how hard it is to do laundry when you've only got 25 litres of water a day and wrap that up in some global narratives of actually, we're all very privileged to have clean water that comes out of a tap. That's something that we take for granted every day. And billions of people around the world don't have that luxury at all.
And that's the other lovely thing about art and poetry and storytelling is that if you do that with humour, it doesn't make it sound preachy, because I think there's also the danger of being preached at, and sometimes the left and progressives are to blame for being good preachers, but they forget whether people are actually listening to them and whether they're interested or not. And that childlike thing I thought was really interesting. I think you mention it in your book as well, the importance of wonder and that sort of childlike wonder that stories can stir up in people, and fun. You mentioned fun as well, that stories can almost get us back to that childlike state of fun. And of course, if you're having fun, you're more likely to engage.
Yeah, yep. Absolutely. I mean, often, the best stories are just the very simple ones, the ones that everybody can engage with, that carry those innate human truths. And, it is a sense of wonder because we get quite wrapped up when someone's telling a story. Time goes by much quicker. We get, you're not worrying about your bills or, all your life problems when somebody's telling a great story. You're there, you're engaged, you're very much with them.
Yeah, so that story listening is important, but also we need to understand the stories we're telling ourselves about ourselves as well, conversely. And I wonder, I think that's really important. We talked about dominant narratives and how they've influenced us. So we need then to understand why we hold the views we do. Do you think then that when I was sort of politically active back in my 20s in the Green movement, there was, a saying, the personal is political. And that was amongst the sort of the hard left, that was kind of seen as, oh, come on, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
This is, airy fairy type stuff. Do you think there's truth in that the personal is political? or can be political.
Yeah. No, I think it is. And it does come back to story. Nothing is more powerful to us than our own stories and the sense of identity that we derive from them. And I think, as I said before, no one feels stupid when a story's being told. You can't argue with somebody else's story. In another one of my poems about climate change, and it's about humanity's whole trajectory from hunter-gatherer societies through to the Industrial Revolution and where we are today. And it's a story that spans 75,000 years of humanity. But I think what made it powerful was that I was a bit cheeky the first time I performed this one. I performed it at another conference of a lot of my peers, and I knew a lot of people in the audience. I was part of the organisation hosting the conference, and I was 5 months pregnant with my daughter, and at the end of the poem, I tied in the unborn child in my belly. And it was the twist at the end of the poem, right? And I had, I had men in suits coming up to me in tears afterwards. And I think it wasn't because of a story that I'd told about humanity and climate change. It was about the personal of weaving in, actually, this is the world that I am bringing a child into. And so it was that personal angle, I think, that really resonates with people. I've had to change, of course, the ending to that poem because one doesn't stay pregnant forever. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you say about that resistance on the political left, and on some degree, we fear that others will judge us if we tell our stories. And it's a very vulnerable thing to do sometimes, but it's precisely that vulnerability that people see in themselves, and that you hold up a mirror to their own story and their own vulnerabilities and their own insecurities and their own worries. So yes, is the personal political? Yes, absolutely. There's a good reason that we're seeing people like Brené Brown being wildly successful because she talks about the power of vulnerability, and it's her story that she tells. And there's no way people can argue with that. They see themselves in it. And I think that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, interesting. Now, in terms of young people, we've got quite a focus on young people on the channel, and the reason for that is the reason that you stated about your child and your child growing up and having to inherit the world that to an extent people of my generation have created. It's not as simple as that, of course. We haven't necessarily individually created, but we've been part of that process, and it's on our watch. And I wonder whether, for young people who are interested in making change, what sort of story practice, because we've identified that story is a really important tool, what sort of simple story practice could they start today, really?
I think start with your values. What is it that you hold most dear? What would that future world look like for yourself, for your community, for your city or nation, to live in those values? And then how can you tell a story about those values? And I encourage you to use your imagination, think outside the box. And I think I talk a little bit in the book about the hero's journey story, and how we can all think of ourselves as on a hero's journey, not as necessarily a big savior hero, mind you, but the character in a storyline. And so looking at personal details of your own story, and you might think, oh, my story is boring, nobody cares about that, but we see ourselves in other people's stories. So sharing, what are the hard moments that you've learned along the way? How can you wrap your story up in the bigger context and narrative of the issues that you're working with? What are your triumphs? What are the teaching moments you've seen along the way? And remember that a hero's journey, that a hero doesn't, succeed by themselves. They have collaborators along the way. So what are the role of other people in the story? And I always think it's a bit of an interesting thought experiment to ask. If you are the hero in your own story, in whose story are you a villain? Because someone out there, you're the them. You're the villain. You're the one who just doesn't get it. You're the one who, they can't understand why you think this way. And so I always, find that interesting to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And you can be very silly with it. You could put yourself into somebody else's head and just have fun with the idea of becoming this other character. One of the things that I used to do when I was practicing new poems and honing my performance is that just for laughs, I would adopt a different persona. So I'd be, oh, okay, I'm going to try this poem in the style of a Southern cowboy, or now I'm going to say it like a sideshow clown, or, now I'm going to say it like a politician giving an inspiring speech. Or so have fun with, how you can play with story, particularly if it's being delivered in a visual or an oratory form. And if you're in the change maker space, if you're doing some sort of important change work in the world, is I think really important to look for the human story. Particularly, if you have a product or something that's a thing or a service, is to look at who is that product helping? How does it change your life? Who are you developing it for? What are the harmful narratives that whatever you're doing is disrupting or challenging? And to just start thinking about life in much more of a storied way.
Yeah, no, I love the hero and villain thing. I think that's a real shock tactic to realise that the way we perceive the world is not quite the way we would like it to be, perhaps. And that would work just beautifully with children. It's just such fun, as you say. It's terrific. I love that. I could speak with you all night, Alina, honestly. But sadly, life does get in the way sometimes. So I just want to ask, what your plans are for the future, and how can people keep in touch with your hero's journey?
Yeah, thank you. At the moment, I'm very curious about the intersections of systems change and story and leadership. Is how we can help, people who are in positions of power to better understand the water in which they're swimming, and to shift some of those levers. I'm particularly interested in how leaders understand themselves, how they understand their traumas or their biases, or how are the experiences they have had shaped the way that they lead and run organisations. So I'm currently embarking on a bit of study exploring how our leaders can be better in touch with their emotions at work. There's typically been, an old school narrative that emotions don't belong at work, but emotions show up at work whether you like it or not. And so it's much better to name them and to recognize that and use them as a strength rather than something that's to be denied. So that's a real curiosity at the moment, is to think about how we can, use story and a vehicle for delivery change through leaders being much more in touch with themselves. you can connect with me on LinkedIn or through my website as well. You can sign up to my newsletter, which is currently on a bit of a hiatus, but I do plan on picking it up again. And that's just at my website, which is alinasiegfried.com. And I'm sure you can put those in show notes or something like that. But I'd love to hear from people, about what they're doing around the world, about how they see story playing out in their own lives and work, and connect with people doing incredible things around the world.
Yeah, and we've got such an opportunity now, haven't we? Because we can connect with people around the world far easier than we could have done 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And we can show things like this, and we can show your film, and somebody in Nigeria or China or wherever can watch it and be inspired by it.
Yeah, and I should say, actually, I don't know if I mentioned to you before, but that film of the poem has been translated to Spanish as well. So there's and it's been reproduced with actors in the same style, but in Spanish by an NGO in Colombia did that. So that's something that you could link below if there are native Spanish speakers that want to watch it in their own language.
Absolutely, we will do. And a cure for them, your poem will be at the end of this podcast conversation as well, and it's on the channel as well. And I really do sincerely ask people to go out and get this book. And there's no accident.
I love all those little markers. It's great to see.
It's green marks in it as well, and that's a sure sign for me that it's a book worth reading for myself, and that a book that I'll return back to, because there are so many interesting points that you make in it. This is available where, Alina?
All sort of major bookseller platforms, really. I mean, I hate to send people to Amazon, but that's the global platform that's possibly easiest. Have a look if you can find it via a local supplier.
Yeah. No, well said. Alina, thank you so much. It's been fascinating, and we'd love to have you back on at some point when you're sort of more along that journey in terms of looking at leadership and narrative and storytelling with leadership. I think it would be fascinating, and we wish you well with your work, because I think you're an important voice. Really important voice for us, because we struggle to articulate the important, we call it consciousness, which I think it is, but I think you really, really do spell it out in very clear and moving terms. So thank you for your work, and we wish you well. Thank you, Alina.
You're very welcome. Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye now.
If we are to believe the stories that dominate our social media feed, there are an evil group of people out there who are out to destroy our lives. They do not share our values. They have no common sense. They will take away your freedom, bombard you with fake news, brainwashing your children with their propaganda. They will do everything in their power to take away all that you hold sacred. Beware. They are out there. The people we call them. Them, the enemy. Them, those other ones. Them, the ones we must overcome, the target of every comment section everywhere. So confident are we that we are the ones who are right. We have turned respectful public debate into millions of miniature individual dictatorships of the mind. The teeth of our savage soundbites grow ever sharper by the day, while indignant ears remain deaf to anything that does not reinforce our worldview. There is no room for reason in a lynch mob. No longer a gift and give and take. No space for context and complexity in a 280-character tweet. The air is growing thin in this here echo chamber. It's getting harder and harder to breathe. We need not even look too far before we can identify a them. Even amongst brothers and sisters in arms, sibling rivalry cuts deep. The climate activist questions the urgency of queer rights if we have no habitable planet to call our home. The unionist challenges foreign aid when a working wage can't even feed our own people. We hear it's the immigrants who are the problem, or those people in SUVs. No, it's the dairy farmers, the greenies, the feminists, the TERFs, the bankers, the church, the NRA. It's corporate welfare, guerrilla warfare, it's the liberal media, the gay agenda, it's them, it's they, it's those people. If only they would stop. Listen. Can you hear that? It is the sound of singular stories. It is the sound of petty distractions. It is the sound of red herrings gasping for breath as the future slips away. Oblivious to our own hypocrisy and wasting our precious energy, we are setting ourselves on fire in the hopes that they will die of smoke inhalation. It need not be this way. We can be better than this. We have the cure for them. It's simple. It is us. What if we took our pointing fingers and we turned them upside down to extend the gentle hand of compromise? Offered up our gifts and contributions with open hearts, embracing grace and humility. That's not to say that we should deny the role of privilege, ignore the wounds from the past, or cease to pursue our passion for change. After all, even the Buddha taught non-violence, not pacifism. But let us dismantle systems of oppression without creating carbon copies addressed to them. Step away from the militancy you have held so close as a lover. Soften your heart and walk a mile in shoes that do not fit. Shoes that cause you discomfort. Blisters edging their way in beneath the soles of the feet you have so firmly planted into the arguments you've convinced yourself are solid. This place is familiar. It is comfortable. But we desperately need to stand upon common ground. For it is there that we can pinpoint the underlying causes behind our addiction to outrage. Feelings of grief, of losing that which we hold dear. Feelings of fear of those we do not understand. Feelings of pain, of leaning into the despair of not knowing how the hell we are going to dig ourselves out of this mess. Respect the collective wisdom that comes from listening to many voices that are different from your own. Find your passion and then you do you, and do it well, while simultaneously seeking to understand why it is that they care so much about something else. According to particle physics, we exchange 98% of the atoms in our bodies with the world around us every year. So I am you, and you are me. And they are us, and we are them. We are them. We are them. To somebody, somewhere, you are them.